Well, the federal and Ontario governments are set to square off in court this week over Ottawa's climate change law. At issue is the validity of Liberal government's legislation that kicked in this month, imposing a charge on gasoline and other fossil fuels, as well as on industrial polluters. Well, Chris Reagan is the chair of Canada's Ecofiscal Commission and McGill University professor, and Ecofiscal is in favor of carbon tax and is an intervener in this court case. Good to have you with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
It seems like a complicated issue. We're going to try to break this down a little bit, including the fact that specifically in BC since 2008 and in Alberta since 2007, there has been a carbon tax program in place. Tell us how it is working in those provinces.
So BC has a carbon tax since 2008. It's revenue neutral. All of the money gets returned in the form of lower income taxes and some rebates to low-income households. It is reducing per capita fuel use, which is where a lot of the emissions come from, so it's working. Alberta's policy that's been in place for a couple of years is a quite well-designed policy that involves household rebates. You'll want to talk about that. Quebec actually has a cap-and-trade system that has been in place for about 5 years. It's working well, and it's worth noting that Ontario had a cap-and-trade system as well. That was a pretty well-designed system. It was linked to Quebec's system, and it got repealed by this government.
Okay, we do want to note that Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick against the carbon tax as it stands right now, saying it will push up the price of gas and heating. But Ontario is saying, listen, we do have, I guess, another or a program that we would like to institute as well. And they say that this will align with the federal government's plan to try to reduce all of these gases. Now, your group is an intervener in this court case. The court case kicks off today. Can you give us a little bit of a preview? What are some of those arguments that you will be making in court for this?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a constitutional expert, and there's going to be a lot of that going on. But we intervened not particularly on the side of the federal government or the side of the provincial government. We intervened, if you like, on the side of the environment and the economy. We intervened on the side of carbon pricing, because it's not just a randomly selected instrument that the federal government is promoting. It's the lowest cost way to reduce emissions. So our view was that every province should be interested in actually reducing emissions at the lowest possible cost. And any province that doesn't do that actually is harming the economy. It's in the national interest to actually reduce emissions at the low cost. Remember that emissions from Ontario don't stay in Ontario. They harm people in other provinces, and they harm people around the world. This is a global collective action problem. So it would be unusual for the federal government, which has some jurisdiction in the environmental space, it would be unusual for the federal government not to be able to behave at all. And the final thing to remember is that the federal policy only kicks in those jurisdictions that don't have their own broad-based carbon price. Ontario used to have one. So the only reason why this federal policy is in place today, and the only reason why this court case is happening today in Ontario, is because Ontario repealed its policy that was fine.
Okay, you mentioned rebates earlier. Let's end on that note, because Canadians, many people doing their taxes now, and they are getting their first climate action incentive rebate.
That's right.
Is that enough to perhaps win over voters to really embrace the federal plan?
Great question. I guess time will tell. But people are getting the rebates through their tax system now. Something like 80% of households will, in fact, receive more in their rebate than they will pay in terms of higher fuel costs. So we'll see. The problem with a tax rebate is that it's not as visible as a check in the mail, which is what happens in Alberta. So that makes it a little bit more tangible, a little bit more real. But I think it's good policy that the federal government has designed.
Okay, you're in court today and the next several days. We appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris.